The old building stood at the edge of the city, shrouded in mist that seemed to cling to its weathered bricks like a second skin. The air around it was thick with the smell of rain and earth. It was a place long forgotten, a remnant of a time when things were built to last, and sometimes it seemed they lasted too long. Inside, the dim light filtered through broken windows, casting weak slanting beams onto cracked tiles. Dust motes hung suspended in the air, swirling like tiny phantoms. The hallway stretched out, lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. There was a peculiar stillness to it, as if time had stopped for the moment the last person left. The floor creaked underfoot as I explored, each step releasing the stale scent of abandonment. Somewhere in the distance, a faint drip, drip, drip echoed the sound of water leaking from unseen pipes. The air was cool and heavy, laced with a faint metallic tang. There was no real reason for me to be there. Perhaps it was curiosity, a need to see what lay beyond the shadows. Perhaps it was a challenge of finding something hidden in a place so deeply forsaken. The thrill of stepping where no one else has dared to tread for years. Dust-covered furniture, forgotten relics of another era, lay strewn about. Some chairs had toppled over and tables were missing legs. There was an unsettling order to the chaos, as if someone has deliberately arranged things to look haphazard. The silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by the occasional groan of the old structure settling into itself. But deeper into the building, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as if the light itself was afraid to reach further in. The hallway at the heart of the building was long, far longer what it appeared from the outside. It stretched out into the darkness with no end in sight. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, buzzing with the sounds that grated on the nerves. The walls were a sickly shade of green, the paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The scent of mildew grew stronger, mingling with something else, something faintly sweet, like a decay masked by a layer of cheap perfume. The doors of either side of the corridor were identical, plain, wooden, each with a small brass handle. The kind of doors that seems to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. The floor tiles were scuffed and cracked, patterns of faded linoleum revealing concrete beneath. There was an odd sense of repetition, as if the corridor was looping back on itself. The hallway was walked for what felt like hours, yet each door looked exactly like the last, each stretch of flickering light the same as before. There was no sound except for footsteps. The dripping water has stopped, the creaks of the old building has faded into silence. All that remained was a hum of the lights and the rhythmic sound of my shoes on tile. The sense of disorientation grew. The hallway seemed to shift subtly, the doors on either side stretching higher, the shadows deepening. It felt as if the walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering imperceptibly. But whenever I looked back, everything appeared normal again, as if the mind was playing tricks. At some point I was thinking of turning back, but there was an instinctive hesitation. It was hard to tell how far the corridor went, and the thought of turning around only to be lost again was unnerving. so I went forward, hoping to find an end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a door in the end of the corridor stood ajar. It was different from the others. The wood was darker, almost blackened, as if scorched. The handle was old, tarnished silver as it gleamed faintly under the flickering light. Pushing the door open revealed a small square room. The air inside was cold, heavy with the scent of something rotting. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper that peeled and curled by the edges, revealing the crumbling plaster underneath. The single window was covered by a thick layer of grime, letting in only the faintest suggestion of light. In the center of the room stood a table. On it I found a tape recorder, old and battered, with a cassette already inside. It was only subject in the room, untouched by dust, as if it had been placed there recently. I hesitated, but eventually I pressed the play button. The recorder clicked and the tape began to spin with a faint whir. At first there was only static, a low hiss that filled the space like a sigh. And then a voice crackled through, distorted and warped, but still unmistakably human. "They're here. They're inside. If you're listening to this, it is too late for you. You can't escape." The voice cut off abruptly, replaced by the sound of breathing. Deep, rigid breaths that seemed to come from right behind. A glance over the shoulder revealed nothing but the empty room, shadows pointing at the corners. The recording continued, the voice trembling now. "Do not look at them. Do not acknowledge them. If you do, they will know you can see them. And then..." The tape clicked off, leaving only the hollow sound of the recorder spinning. The feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore now, a prickling sensation at the back of the neck. The shadows seemed to move, twitching at the edges of vision, but when I turned towards them they froze as it caught in the act. Leaving the room felt urgent now. I pushed the door open, but the corridor beyond was different. The lights were dimmer, the green walls now a sickly brown. The doors on either side stood open, gaping back mouths that led into nothingness. The hallways seemed to stretch even further than before, the end lost in darkness. My footsteps echoed louder in the silence. The sensation of being followed grew stronger with every step, an invisible presence drawing closer, though no sound accompanied it. An instinct to run was almost overwhelming, but something about the voice on the tape came back, a warning not to acknowledge what was there. Forward, only forward. The lights began to flicker more violently, plunging the corridor into darkness for longer intervals. Each time the lights blinked back in, the hallway seemed to shift, the door closer together, the walls pressing in. The air reeked of damp rot, thick enough to choke on. The shadows at the edge of vision grew bolder, creeping closer with every flicker of the light. There were glimpses of shapes now. Tall, elongated figures that swayed unnaturally, their limbs stretching and bending in ways that defied anatomy. Yet, whenever the lights fully returned, the figures vanished. A breath of cold air whispered past and there was a sound. Not the familiar drippers groan of the building, but a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled along the tiles. It was close, almost directly behind, yet nothing appeared when turning to look. The corridor seemed endless now, an infinite stretch of darkness and flickering lights. The floor felt like it was tilting, the walls warping as the entire building was slowly collapsing in on itself. The sense of being hunted became overwhelming, and then the lights went out entirely. The darkness was absolute, pressing in from all sides. The sound of dragging, wet footsteps grew louder, impossibly close. I held my breath and listened to my pounding heart. A whisper, cold and sickly sweet, brushed against the air, so close it felt like lips had almost touched my skin. Turn around. I know you see me. There was no time to scream before a cold, wet hand closed around my arm, pulling me into the darkness. The last thing I remember were lights flickering back on to reveal an empty stretch of hallway, and a faint scent of decay lingering the air, and somewhere in the distance, the drip, drip, drip sound that began again. But for me, it was over.